Now, I'd like to just move on to John for the sake of time. John Zeckendorf is an asset manager with a substantial business of his own. Before that, I think interestingly, he was an asset manager for one of the richest men in the world, who is the Sultan of Brunei. I remember living in Malaysia once and trying to get an appointment with the Sultan and absolutely failing. So perhaps I should have gone to see John. I began to realize how significant John was in the climbing world when I was visiting Tasmania with Peter a couple of years ago, and we went on a walk up a rather, I would say, insignificant hill. I think it actually described itself as a mountain, but it really wasn't a mountain. And as we walked up this hill, John and I were plodding up this hill, and John suddenly stopped me and said, "Oliver, you're doing it all wrong." And I said, "What?" I've walked up thousands of hills and mountains in my time. He said, no. You have to put your foot down like this, and then you've got to go, and then you put the other one down. And I sort of like, yeah, okay. And then I took Peter to one side and said, John was trying to tell me how to walk up a hill. What's going on? He said, if I were you, I would listen to what he's got to say, because he actually has climbed Everest. So I've been doing it ever since, John. Welcome, John, and we look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
We're going to come back to Everest, of course, and how to climb. I do recall that story, Oliver. I thought it was rather amusing. But let's start off with the simple things. Where exactly is home for you, John? Because I follow you on Strava, and one moment you're in Port Douglas, the next moment you're in Tassie, sometimes you're in Sydney, now you're in Berry in regional New South Wales. So yeah, where is your home?
I'm a COVID refugee at the moment. For the last 9 weeks, I've been living out of a suitcase, trying to avoid COVID restrictions. So yeah, permanent home is in Tassie, just outside Hobart. Currently residing, or previously residing in Sydney, because we're attending to some family issues, and then at the moment in Berry, but sort of a vagrant.
Okay. And being a bit of a nomad, as you say, a COVID refugee, it must help having a portfolio of motels dotted around the country. Is that a bit of an unlikely investment during a pandemic?
Well, to be fair, we've been doing it for about 15 years now, so we didn't quite have the pandemic in mind. Yeah, it's very handy having a bunch of different places we can stay in. And that's the good side of it. The bad side is we're obviously getting hammered by travel restrictions at the moment. So yeah, it's probably at this stage, it's actually a very good time to be buying into hotels, but that's probably not for reasons that are particularly good. There's a lot of people wanting to get out and needing to get out at the moment, which creates an awful lot of opportunities for those who want to get in at good prices. But yeah, it's an interesting and difficult time on the operational side.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, worst comes to worst, I guess you could always go back to your original profession. That was in insolvency, I gather.
Yes. I specialized on the dark side. So when I was a child, my brother-in-law used to come over to family dinners, and he'd been sent to an insolvency section of his accounting firm. And this was the late 80s, early 90s, which was the recession we had to have. And he absolutely hated it, and started going on about how terrible it was being an insolvency person. And I listened to what he was saying and all the controversy and fighting and arguing and things like that, and thought, wow, that sounds kind of cool. I think I'll get into that. So I decided to do accounting, went in for a cadetship at Price Waterhouse, and they said basically, you know, we don't normally take people in insolvency, but given there's a boom on, we'll quite happily take you. So I managed to jump straight into kind of where I wanted to go.
Yeah, a boom of sorts.
Oh, strange times.
Yes. So then from then on, you spent the time at Price Waterhouse, and as Oliver mentioned, you even worked with the Prince of Brunei.
Quite. So yeah, look, the great thing about big accounting firms is you can get an awful lot of experience pretty easily. I had a bunch of once in a lifetime jobs while I was at Pricewaterhouse, and then left them to go and work for another once in a lifetime job working for Prince Geoffrey. So I spent just under 3 years as his asset manager. And they told me the good stuff, which is you've got about $5 billion of assets to look after. But forgot to tell me the bad stuff, which is you've also got about $35–40 billion of liabilities to manage. Suddenly I understood why they wanted an insolvency person doing the job.
Tell us, how did you actually land the job? And yeah, was it a rigorous kind of interview process?
It was an enormously rigorous interview process. You don't just get thrown the keys to billions of dollars of assets sort of on a whim. I'd love to tell you there were deep psychometric tests and experiences and quizzes and things like that. Actually, the only question I was asked in my job interview was, would you like a cappuccino? To which I answered yes. I then watched the guy that became my future boss manage 3 telephones for 45 minutes and watched him juggling calls, and it was impressive. And then he said, I'm so sorry, I've got to go. We'll be in touch. That was my interview. To be slightly fair, I'd come recommended by my predecessor, and the interview was barely a formality.
Yes. So tell us, what was it like? I mean, give us a bit of an insight into, I mean, it was some years ago now, of course, but yeah, what was it like actually working for him, and what did you see and experience? I'm assuming it was a little surreal.
Yeah, well, for those who are sort of younger and don't remember the front page stories of Geoffrey, Geoffrey and the Sultan fell out in what became one of the most spectacular family disputes. The Sultan was the richest man in the world, kind of vying with Bill Gates at the time. But the Sultan was easily the richest man in the world, and Geoffrey and the Sultan went on these binges that you had to read about to believe, and even that didn't capture everything that was there. There were cars, palaces, marble palaces in the middle of the jungle in Brunei. There was wine, women, song, you name it. It was a life of obscene opulence. So I came in towards the end of it. They weren't spent, or Geoffrey in particular wasn't spending as much in those days. The Sultan was sort of starting to calm down and change a little bit, but Geoffrey certainly, once the money had been cut off, ended up basically in a declining empire, and that was part of my job, was to fix the mismatch between his assets and his liabilities.
I gather there were a few cars that you could choose from when you visited.
There was what was affectionately known as the garage. This was just the Prince's garage, not the Sultan had another one that was like it. 2,500 cars, average price probably about £100,000+. So you're talking, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Rolls Royces, pretty much a 29-year-old's dream garage. Whenever I was in town, I was allowed to pop in, grab whatever had been serviced and was available, and I worked my way through chunks of the garage.
So I assume you weren't really even though it was an experience, as you say, as a 29-year-old. I take it you weren't exactly envious of the prince. What did that experience, I guess, tell you about some of the dangers?
Probably the best advice I got from my predecessor was don't actually have anything to do with the prince. Somebody like that gets the modern day equivalent of an old English court around them, and there's a whole bunch of hangers-on. Usually parasite is probably a more accurate term, and it's very political and very backstabbing. In the end, my boss got stabbed in the back literally by the hairdresser. And so keeping well away from the prince and that court firstly let me do my job more effectively, and secondly meant I wasn't getting corrupted by all the parties and everything else that was going on. So staying away from it was probably the best thing. We had enough headaches to look after. It was an incredibly full-time, all-in job. But when you're taking out somebody's garbage and cleaning up after them, It's often better not to actually know the person that you're doing that for. So I did keep a distance there, but having watched all of that, it was actually quite sad in lots of ways. There's a book in the Bible that's written by one of the richest dudes in history, King Solomon, and it talks about, there's one little phrase in it that says, "I gave pleasure a good go, and I tried everything that I could possibly think of, and found that it was completely meaningless." And that really sums up the prince. He really gave pleasure a good go. I mean, everything you can think you might want one of, he had hundreds of. He tried everything. He spent, billions on this. And ironically, when it was all stripped away from him at the end, and part of the settlement was that he had to give up most things, he actually found probably the first real relationship he had in his life. And ironically, with a Kiwi housekeeper. But that was probably where he's found the most happiness. It was actually in a really simple, real, genuine relationship. It wasn't all the stuff. It wasn't all the, all the things that he tried to fill the void with.
No, thanks for sharing that observation. John, I've also got to know you firsthand a little, doing a number of treks together, which were very enjoyable. And hearing your story, I can tell that you're very a driven person. And I thought it'd be perhaps good just to reflect a bit deeper, if you may, on your personality. You strike me as someone who is quite happy to take the contrarian view, quite happy to go against the flow at times. Perhaps, investing in motels right now as an example. You're someone, I think, who does their homework, and once they've done that, you really, back your convictions. Do you think that's sort of a fair assessment? How would you reflect on your own personality?
I try not to think too much about myself, to be honest, because you end up just getting disappointed. I certainly like to go where others don't. And I found one of the big differentiators is actually how much hard work you're prepared to put in. A lot of people are far more talented than I am, or are stronger, certainly in the climbing world. They're much stronger, better technical climbers than I am. I'm just prepared to put in an obscene amount of work to achieve something. Regional motels are a fantastic asset class there, but they're small, they're disparate, you're spread out over a country that's the size of Europe. It's hard work. Most people won't go for that because it's just too hard. And I think that's probably the thing that differentiates is once you've picked a route, the determination to just keep going at it.
And the comfort in being able to, I guess, go against the grain, go against the flow. Other people might be more concerned with, fitting in. What do you put that down to?
I'm not sure. Partly personality. I come from a Jewish background, so arguing and being contrarian is probably somewhere in my DNA also. I think it is just a personality. It's part of my personality. I think when people say you can't do something, it suddenly becomes a lot more attractive. So there may be an element of that in there also.
Well, speaking of your Jewish background, do you think some of those traits that you've just, exhibited and mentioned, that they were evident also in your own, I guess, spiritual journey, your faith journey, because you actually made a conscious decision to, embrace, Jesus as your kind of, savior. So tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, look, you don't get much more contrarian than being a Jewish person who decides to follow Jesus. There are a few no-nos in Judaism, and that's definitely one of them. You can quite happily be a Buddhist and still be accepted as Jewish, but following Jesus is generally one of the please don't do that. So I grew up in a Jewish family. I liked arguing. I met a girl who was a Christian. I thought she was rather interesting, so we started dating, and she started telling me all about Jesus, and I like to argue. So I just argued. She thought she was making progress in explaining who Jesus was to me and introducing me to him. And I was just enjoying arguing because that's kind of what I do. So after some time, she got fed up with that and dumped me, to my great surprise. And I went to work and complained to all my work colleagues that my girlfriend dumped me because I wasn't a Christian. Most of them said, don't worry, you'll find someone else. And one manager I had a lot of time for actually pulled me aside and said, no, she's right. Jesus makes some outrageous claims, and you've got to consider, are those claims true or not? And so I thought, okay, if they are true, then it's important. So yeah, let's consider what the claims he makes are. So I spent quite a lot of time reading through the Bible, talking with many, many people. It was probably about a 6-month process, and looking at what promises are made about Jesus, what things are said that what he will do and what his job will look like. And, there are things that are said about him many years before he actually came. And so I spent a lot of time looking at that and things that are recorded in the Bible and talking about, okay, one day someone will come and this is what they will do. And so I looked at all those incidents of it, compared that to the life of Jesus and thought, oh, wow, there's way too many coincidences here. He has to be born in a certain time, in a certain place, in a certain way, and so on. So for me, it was a very logical process of tearing apart, scriptures that had been around for hundreds of years before Jesus and comparing them to the evidence of who Jesus was and deciding, yes, he fulfilled all those criteria and that nobody else was able to. And so for me, that's it was a very intellectual process. But probably about 6 months after, I decided, yeah, actually, he probably is who he says he is, and maybe that is important, and maybe he is worth following. I went, oddly enough, abseiling down a waterfall. I think you've got a photo of that, actually. I was abseiling down a waterfall. It was flooded in midwinter in just outside Goulburn in Bungonia Gorge. So those of you who know that area well will know that you don't go swimming in a creek that's flooded in midwinter just outside, pretty much outside Canberra. It's rather cold. And so I've dropped down into this waterfall, pretty much came very close to drowning in it. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm going to drown here. This is unpleasant. It was very calm, rational. It wasn't any of this sort of, it was very calm and considered. And okay, I'm going to drown here. Oh, that's right. There's this God thing. Maybe he might be able to help me. And so it was just okay, Jesus, if you're real, now would be a good time to show me something. Got spat out of the waterfall, climbed up onto a rock. And you know how when you go through a traumatic event, you sort of replay it in your mind and go, wow, I can't believe that just happened. And I was replaying it in my mind and I thought, called out to God. I was pinned down by a waterfall, called out to God, got spat out by the waterfall, and here I am. And it suddenly just hit me, oh, it's real. And as it hit me, it was like a cup of hot water going into my heart. And then as my heart was beating, it went around my body, which was really important because I was probably pretty close to hypothermia at the stage. And that sort of warmed me up. And we managed to climb out the side of Bungonia Gorge because we were running out of sunlight at that point. Managed to climb out of the side of the gorge. I've been down that gorge probably another 10 times. And I still don't know how we managed to scale a 300+ meter cliff. Somehow we found a goat trail up there. So yeah, I think at that point it became very real, not just in my head, but very much transformed to, okay, this is different to an intellectual knowledge.
Yeah, fascinating. So both the analytical, but also very experiential in. Yeah. And speaking of experience, I mean, many years prior to that, you've always had a love for the outdoors and the mountains, clearly. And you had a bit of a mountaintop experience quite early on as a young man. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. At the end of high school, I did a 2-month trek and rafting. We basically made a list of everything we'd ever heard of in Tasmania and decided to walk it and raft it and climb it when we were down there. at the end of high school. So towards the end of that time, I was up on one of the mountain ranges there, the Western Arthurs. Got to one of the mountaintops at the end of that, and you just get this incredible view. It was a glorious day. You could see for miles and miles and miles. And I'd always considered myself an atheist. I have a different view on atheism now, but I'd always considered myself an atheist. And I think at that point, I was just surrounded by so much incredible beauty, and I'd been immersed in the most extraordinary wilderness, or one of the most extraordinary areas we have in Australia. I'd been immersed in it for about 2 months. I'd been physically interacting with it, all that sort of stuff. And it just hit me, there is no way this happened by accident. And I think on that mountaintop, I can pinpoint a time where I just went, yeah, this, I went from being an atheist to being, there's something out there. I just don't know what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And mountains, obviously, from then on, have always played a big part of your life. Not everyone chooses to take it to the extremes that you have, having climbed the highest peak in 7 continents, including, of course, Mount Everest. You said before that you're prepared to put the work in. It must have been a lot of work to prepare for Everest and indeed even to climb it. So I've got a few photos I'm going to share in a moment, but just tell us a little bit about the endeavour and what it's like.
Well, so you don't wake up one morning and decide you want to climb Everest. And if you do, the odds are on you either won't make it or you won't come back. So Everest was sort of the next logical step in my climbing career. I'd started off, I'd always done lots of outdoor stuff and adventures. Accidentally went to the Himalayas as part of I had a friend who was a doctor running medical clinics in Sikkim. And he invited me to come along as a trekker because we wanted to go from village to village and bring the clinic to the people rather than the other way around. So I went there with my son. My son has no medical training, nor do I, given he was 9 at the time. His job was to blow up balloons and entertain all the kids who came along to the clinics, because people would come from other villages, and he entertained the kids while they were waiting in line. So as part of that, we went to the base of the 3rd highest mountain in the world, Kachinjunga, and we just looked up at that and went, that's kind of cool. And so we decided to learn a bit more about climbing. I went to New Zealand, did a climbing course, and we booked in for Kilimanjaro. Kili is not a climb. It's basically a high altitude bushwalk without the bush. So it's pretty easy. Pretty much anyone who's moderately fit can do it. Takes a bit of time, a little bit of training, but it's pretty easy. So that was fun. And then basically started working my way through a fairly long list of other climbs. Everest is kind of the one that brings all those climbs together. So you take the freezing cold conditions of Antarctica, the high winds and the crap weather of Denali, the long expedition of Aconcagua. You sort of bring all of those together into one mountain and then add a few extra things like wearing a down suit and oxygen systems and a 2-month expedition. But for me, Everest was, my training mountain was always Mount Wellington in Hobart, the big mountain that sort of dominates the skyline behind Hobart. You can get about a 900-metre ascent starting from the bottom of that up to the summit. And that's about as much as any camp is apart from each other on Everest. And so I probably climbed Welly maybe 200 times, maybe 300 times. I'd run up it, I'd do it once, I'd do it twice, I'd do it 3 times, I'd do it backwards, I'd do it with a big pack on, a little pack on, every combination you can think of. If it snowed and rained and the weather was crap, I'd get up and do it again. And sort of go up in the worst weather conditions I could possibly find. So what I'd kind of taught myself is I can do Mount Wellington regardless of the weather conditions, of how crap I'm feeling, how sick I am, all of those things. And so when it actually came to doing Everest, I just thought of it as it's just like doing Mount Wellington 5 times. And I've done Mount Wellington, in every condition you can possibly imagine. And so it really just became another Mount Wellington.
But Mount Wellington doesn't have an ice fall.
Not in most conditions. So yeah, so the first bit of climbing Everest, so Everest is about a 2-month expedition. You spend about 2 weeks walking into base camp. That's slower than you do if you did the sort of the bushwalking thing. Thoroughly recommend Everest Base Camp. It is one of the most spectacular walks in the world. It's culturally interesting, it's fascinating, and you don't get anything like the ice flow here.
Yeah.
So once you do that, you then go, the first bit out of base camp is actually going through the ice flow. It's the most dangerous bit of the mountain. You do it 6 times. You get the infamous snakes and ladders. And it's a very dynamic environment. It moves by about 3 feet every day. And so it is very dangerous. You basically work your way up that valley that you can see sort of in the center left of the photo. That's called the Kum. So Camp 1 is at the far end of that valley. Camp 2 is at the bottom of the hill that you're seeing us standing on. Camp 3 is halfway up the hill, which you can't see. And then Camp 4 is at the bottom of that pyramid. That's the main pyramid of the south face of Everest. And that's Camp 4 is sort of in that little valley that is sort of at the same height we're on. And then if you're lucky, you get to continue up over what's called the South Summit. It looks like you've made the summit of Everest, but sadly the real summit's another hour and a half away. You go along this sort of wavy ridge line, which has a 3,000 meter drop on one side and a 2,000 meter drop on the other side. If you slip off that, it's called taking the grand descent. And there used to be a flurry of bright colored, you could see everyone's down suits who had fallen off. They did clean this up about 15 years ago, but you could see down in the valley these all the bodies of people who had fallen off before it's as well roped as it is these days. So that's actually Hillary's Step. There was a big earthquake in 2014 that took away the big rock that was there, mostly where those people are. There was a fairly famous photo of that taken from a bit further back 2 years ago, which showed a massive traffic jam. That looks like we've got a traffic jam there, but that's actually the rest of my team. So there was no traffic jam at all for us. And after 10 years of training and preparation, and I don't know how many gallons of sweat, you spend 11 minutes on the summit. That's a pretty typical outcome. You have sitting in your pocket of your down suit, you have all the flags you wanted get photos of. That's the Tasmanian flag that was given to me by one of our local state members of parliament. I think that photo ended up on the front page of the Mercury, actually shortly after I'd arrived back in Hobart.
And then the descent was a little bit quicker.
Well.
So this is actually those waterfalls you were mentioning.
This is a different one, actually. This is in Blue Mountains, but it is one of my favourite waterfalls. So I'm not just into mountaineering. I quite like canyoning, waterfalls, all that sort of stuff as well. And occasionally my wife lets me out again.
Well, maybe just we're going to pass it over to questions to the men in just a moment. But there've been a number of documentaries lately about the tragedies that are happening in Everest, and indeed the Sherpas tend to bear the brunt of most of the risk. Is there a bit of a moral dilemma here in terms of Westerners coming and climbing Everest?
Yeah, look, there's many moral dilemmas. The moral issues often work in ways unexpected, and the one that's very advertised is these guys don't get paid much, and they're doing the riskiest job. Having spent quite a lot of time with Sherpas, and I've got a lot of mates who are Sherpas, including the guy who's now got the record for the most summits of Everest. He was part of our team, so I got to know him pretty well also. If those guys aren't employed, they don't eat, and their families don't eat. And so not employing them also has its drawbacks. If we decide we're not going to use the Sherpas, first of all, yes, that will change a whole bunch of stuff, but it'll really destroy entire villages and families. And so that's another angle to the moral issue. Are they underpaid? Yes. Has that changed a lot in the last few years? Absolutely. it is an imperfect, broken world that we live in, full of occasions when you have to choose the less bad option at times. The Sherpas love working. They realize it's risky. They do have a very strange idea of life and death. They are very karmic. And so part of that philosophy is, better luck next time. And so, things like there are safety lines and they won't clip into them. So some of the risk isn't purely just down to their workplace. It's also down to how they respond to that. There are a whole bunch of other moral issues on Everest, like stepping over dead bodies or dying bodies and things like that. And again, there's two sides to that issue as well. Our team was very self-sufficient. We paid quite a large sum of money to make sure we had lots of oxygen and extra resources on the mountain. And if anything went wrong, we were rescuing ourselves. We didn't need help from anybody else. Lots of people don't climb with that backup. They go on a cheaper expedition where they don't have that backup. And then, part of the question is, well, is it right for them to be on the mountain without the ability to rescue themselves? Things do go wrong on mountains. Is it right for them to assume that somebody else will come and rescue them? So it's a terrible environment. It forces, choices that aren't ideal.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you. There's so many more angles we could have touched on, but I do want to leave time for the men to ask questions. So first up, Grant, you have a question. I'm going to ask to unmute you.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, John. Thanks very much for making your time available. I'm just interested in not only the physical feats of walking up mountains, but the mental challenge that you would have experienced on some of those climbs. And I remember you telling one story once about a mountain that you couldn't quite get to the summit despite how close you were, and what you went through to try and overcome that fear. And I find the mental side of those challenges quite interesting. So I was just wondering if you could share that with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. It's look, I mentioned earlier that I'd climbed Wellington, hundreds of times in all conditions, and so part of climbing a mountain is breaking down a huge task, and this doesn't just apply to mountain climbing, to lots of things. Breaking down an enormous task into smaller, more manageable goals, and then build up your training levels so you can achieve each of those goals, put them together, and that's your mountain. Everest is probably the hardest expedition because it's a 2-month game of chess with an inanimate object, and the conditions have all got to be right. You've got to be well, you've got to be fit and healthy, prepared, acclimatized, and in the right weather at the right time with the right resources around you. And if all of those things don't come together, then you probably won't make it, or you'll be exposed to risk. So I think getting the mental right on that is really challenging. And I think most people attack Everest as a physical thing and they ignore the mental thing. Everest throws unpredictable things at you, but Denali, the one in Alaska, probably is more famous for that. And so part of my training for Denali was to basically say, you've got to introduce a random factor. If you're going to go out and run 10 kilometers, you'll go out and run 10. And your body will adjust to that and your mind will adjust to that. What happens if you suddenly have to run another 10 kilometers? Well, if you prepare for that and say, I'm going to run 20, then it's a different mental thing. You need the unexpected element. So I'd carry a dice with me and I'd throw the dice, and if it came up a 6, I would repeat whatever the activity I'd just done was. And it might be a half-hour run, or it might be a 8-hour bushwalk with a pack or something like that. And so my wife would often get calls at 5 o'clock in the afternoon saying, sorry, dear, I'll see you at 2 a.m. I've just rolled a 6, knowing that, and it's the only way you can really prepare mentally for that sort of adjustment. I think people that didn't pay attention to that really struggled. And sometimes, so that's the big picture down to smaller chunks. Sometimes you've just got to take, and the story I think you're referring to, you've just got to take the next step. And you kind of ignore the big picture and just realize, what's the next thing I have to do ahead of me? Can I just take that next step? And climbing a mountain, climbing Everest is pretty easy. It's just 29,000 easy steps. You just have to put them all together. And so there were times, certainly on Everest, I got sick at Camp 2. I had dysentery at Camp 2 when we were on our last summit rotation. So I basically climbed with no energy. And there were plenty of times on that when I was literally on my hands and knees, just thinking, can I take the next step? You know, forget where I am on the mountain, forget all of that, just take the next step. And so you need a mixture of both of those things. And yeah, I think older people probably do a bit better than younger people because they tend to have that mental toughness. Women do a lot better than men. The summit rate for women is much higher than men. And actually people who are less fit or feel that they are less prepared tend to do a lot better than those who are typically young and confident because they're taking it more easily and they win on the mental side.
I have a question here from Will.
Hi, John. So for a bit of background, I'm predominantly a rock climber, but I've been out and been on a couple of mountains in the Himalayas. And to me, it seems that the intersection between those climbing and mountaineering worlds and the Christian one is pretty small. Just wondering if that's been your experience. And if so, do you think there's anything particular that could be done about it?
I think you're absolutely right. I've come across maybe one or two other Christians on climbs, not always followers of Jesus, but people who are sometimes quite loud in their proclamations. I think it's a bit like, was it Eisenhower or someone in World War II that said there are no atheists in foxholes? There are no atheists on the ice floe. You are in an intimidating environment where, you know, unpredictable death is sort of around you, and most people are freaked out a little bit by that. And so even on lesser climbs or less dangerous climbs, on the way up, it's pointless trying to talk to anybody about faith. They're just goal orientated and just, you know, I want to make the summit, I want to make the summit. On the way back down, it's totally different. Everybody wants to talk about the spiritual experience they've just had. And so it is actually an interesting time. You do actually start to find out what people really think. And quite often, I mean, you'll know this from your climbing, if you've been through that traumatic experience together, there's a bond between you that kind of lasts for the rest of your lives, even if you rarely talk to each other. And you see it in, you know, war buddies and, you know, people who've done major jobs together and things like that in the business world. You sort of have that confidence and trust in each other that kind of goes forever. And so there are some conversations that come out of those sorts of things. But I think a lot of climbers are pretty unfulfilled. I mean, that's why they're climbing. They're looking for the adventure and the risk and all of that to fill a hole. They may not know that's why they're doing it, but I think it's a pretty common ailment. But you're right, there aren't many Christians in that world, and anyone else that would like to get into it, happy to help.
John, we have a few more questions with not much time, so we're going to speed through a few. So I've got a question from Peter Moll.
Yes, good morning, John. My question is, as a converted Christian, how do you reconcile what I understand to be profiting financially from the distressed sale of country properties?
Yeah, look, great question. Firstly, we haven't profited yet. That's something we're seeing coming up shortly. The worst thing you can do for someone in distress is not put them out of their misery. And I know that sounds fairly rough, but actually, when I was a liquidator, the best night's sleep any of our directors had when the day after we were appointed, because they suddenly didn't have to deal with this trauma anymore. It universally came as a relief to them. And so while it seems terrible that, oh gosh, you know, you've come in and you've removed all of the, you know, the livelihood from this person, it was quite the opposite. It was a tremendous relief for them. So we haven't actually bought distressed yet. We are expecting the current lockdown and the current government response is very different to JobKeeper. There is very little support for the businesses this time. The pain is as real as it was last year. And we're seeing at the moment people, I mean, a lot of the sales are actually driven less by finance and more by what I would call post-traumatic stress. People have just mentally snapped. They can't handle this anymore. They can hold on sometimes financially, but mentally they can't. So how do I reconcile it? Kind of that way, but yeah, it's not a perfect world we're in.
Question from Oliver Sewer.
John, I've climbed Kilimanjaro, and I'm just wondering what would be probably the next goal if I want to do some more of these peaks.
Yeah, absolutely. Kili's awesome. So I'd go for, if you want to start working your way on the 7, then I'd go for Everest next. But in between that, I would, if you're ever allowed out of Australia, go to South Island, New Zealand, do a technical mountaineering course and learn the ropes. Because even if you've been a rock climber, as we had earlier, it's a whole different skill set, particularly the cold weather. But Elbrus is about as hard as Kili, but it involves crampons for most of it. So it's a great next step. There's stuff in New Zealand, aspiring would be good. And some other stuff similar to that, but you'd be aiming for something with a bit of altitude and but relatively easy, untechnical climbing.
You'd wait before you attempted Kosi, I assume. You'd have to give that a bit.
So very quick story. I've got a friend who climbed 6 of the 7 mountains, all done on the first attempt, which is unusual. And he hadn't done Kosciuszko. And he was an airline pilot. He got stuck in Hong Kong for a few extra days, worked out that he could fly down, climb Kosi, and be back up in time to take his next flight. And he didn't make it. Kosi can often have some of the worst weather of any of the mountains.
We have a final question from Asiri.
Thank you, John. My question, John, is I assume because as you are Jewish and you became a Christian, there would have been a high cost to pay. So can you tell about like those obstacles or the cost you had to pay and how you overcame that, or how you decided still it's worth it? So.
Once you find out something that you think is true, you kind of have to follow it, or you create a whole bunch of dissonance in your life. So once I decided it was true, it was very difficult to not follow, regardless of the price. I knew my parents wouldn't take it too well. By the way, I got back together with the girl and married her, and we've now got 4 children. I don't know if she was rewarded for her persistence or that became the price she paid. You can ask Jo later, those of you who know her. So my parents didn't react well. Mum didn't come to the wedding at all. Dad came to the reception only. There was certainly a huge distance put between, I didn't go to family dinners anymore for a number of years. And that was probably for maybe 8 years or so. It's amazing what having grandchildren will do to melt hearts. And so when we started having children, those barriers started to come down, and we started to sort of be welcomed back into the family, because actually we're the only grandchildren on my parents' side. So that did change the equation. But yeah, there was certainly quite a large cost there.
Mm. Thank you, gentlemen, for your questions, and thank you, John, once again for opening up your life to us and your heart. The plan from here on in, next week, we do have small groups, as Oliver indicated at the outset. So if you'd like to find out more about those small groups, which are an opportunity to get to know some of the other men, to reflect on some of the things that John and other speakers have shared, can I encourage you to give it a go? There'll be a feedback email that comes out, and you can indicate on that your interest. You can just come along once or twice and see what you think. Also, you can drop me a note and I can organize that for you. Future meetings like this, we'll let you know by email. If you're not receiving the email, again, just let me know, or you can indicate on the feedback if you'd like to find out about these meetings. I'm going to invite Al to say a closing prayer. You have to be unmuted, Al. I know God can hear you, but we can't. Yeah, maybe now.
I did.
Go for it.
Okay, unmute again. Righto. Thank you, God, for how you've been at work in John's life. Thank you that you've enabled him to see the beauty in creation and find so much joy in that. Thank you that he's come to know the Lord Jesus and know forgiveness. Thank you for the energy and the resources that you've given him. We thank you for his generosity to others with the wealth that he has and how he's blessed other people. And ask, please, you be with John as he loves and cares for his family. And for all of us, Father, we ask, please, that we might use this time when many of us are locked down, when life is slowed down, to think hard on what really matters to us and where we'll find real meaning and purpose. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Al. And gentlemen, once again, thank you for coming along, and hope to see you very soon, either in this forum or in one of our small groups. Have a great day and a good weekend. Bye-bye.